Hey guys, I'm Emmeline, aka Winterstar Cosplay, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you how to create Childe's Foul Legacy mask from the game Genshin Impact. This video was sponsored by Worbla, and I'm excited to use their Worbla's black art to show you how to create this mask. So, first off, I needed to create a pattern for the mask. I did this by going through the game and finding some great screenshots, which I then used in a digital vector drawing app to create a nice vector pattern for it. I then printed out the pattern, taped it together, and cut it out. I actually had to do this twice until I found a size and a shape that I liked, but once I did that, it was time to start dividing the mask into different pieces. First off, I would need the base piece, which I sketched onto the actual pattern of the mask and then traced onto 2mm EVA foam from TNT Cosplay Supply. I used a silver marker from TNT Cosplay Supply to do this, since silver markers show up really well on black EVA foam. Once I was done sketching on the base back piece for the mask, I used my box cutter knife to cut it out. Once that was done, I went back to the original mask pattern and cut out all of the individual pieces that would lay on top of the base plate. There were quite a few of these, and it took some thought to figure out how they would all lay on top of each other. But for all of them, I first started out by tracing them onto more 2mm EVA foam from TNT Cosplay Supply. I then moved on to cutting them all out, again with my box cutter knife, until I ended up with a whole bunch of small EVA foam pieces. The only part of the pattern where I really had to make any super special adjustments were the long twisty horn things at the top. These on the pattern were already in a twisted shape, but I knew that to get them into that twisted shape, I needed to start out with them being laid flat. So I cut apart the pattern until it laid in a flat shape and then traced those long, thin pieces onto more 2mm EVA foam. Once I'd cut both of those out, one for each side, this is what they looked like, long and straight, that I would then, as you can see here, be able to shape into a nice curved, twisted thing. And once I had cut out all of the base EVA foam pieces, this is what they looked like. They still needed a little bit of adjustment, but I was overall pretty happy with how they looked. All of them were cut out of 2mm EVA foam from TNT Cosplay Supply, except for one small curved piece, which was a little bit thicker. And now that all the EVA foam base pieces were complete, it's time to move on to the Worbla. This video was sponsored by Worbla, and they sent me this Worbla's black art to create this mask out of. I already used it to create Childe's smaller mask, and I was excited to use it here again. To trace all the pieces onto the black Worbla, I just used a simple pencil. Since I would be sandwiching each of the EVA foam pieces inside of two pieces of Worbla of the same size, I first needed to trace two copies of all of the EVA foam pieces onto the black Worbla. After tracing them on, I also added a small amount of what you might call seam allowance along all of the edges so that I would be able to sandwich the EVA foam in between the pieces. I did this not only for the largest base piece, but also for all of the individual smaller pieces of EVA foam, tracing them all twice onto the black Worbla. One of the things that is an essential tool when you're working with Worbla is a heat gun. This is the type that I use. First off, for cutting out all of the different Worbla pieces, I first started out by heating up the Worbla. This makes it softer and easier to cut through. Once I heated up a small section, I was able to cut through it a lot easier with my box cutter. I had to work section by section, reheating the Worbla as I went because it cooled down pretty quickly. After I'd cut out two pieces of Worbla for each piece of EVA foam, it was time to connect them together. I first started out by thoroughly heating up the pieces of black Worbla on both sides, then sandwiching the piece of EVA foam in between them and pressing down the edges, heating it up more and then using my fingers to shape the Worbla along the edges of the EVA foam. Once I finished heating up and pressing down all of the edges, it looked pretty good, but I still needed to get rid of these huge seam allowances along the outside. To do this, I started out by heating up the Worbla again, and then using my box cutter to trim very closely along the sides of the piece, taking off the edges and then smoothing and squishing it down again with my fingers. To make the edges nice and even along the curves and straight lines, I also used the back end of a marker to further smooth them out. And once it was done, this is what the completed piece looked like. I then just had to repeat this step for all of the other foam pieces, sandwiching them in between two pieces of Worbla, heating them up, pressing all the edges down, and then trimming off the edges with my box cutter, smoothing the edges again afterwards. To get these long, twisty horn pieces in the right shape, I first thoroughly heated them up on both sides after sandwiching the foam in between the Worbla, and then took my original pattern piece, laying the Worbla piece on top of it, and then carefully shaping it into the correct shape with my fingers, holding it in that position until it cooled down enough that it would just stay in that position. I then repeated this process for the horn on the other side of the mask, except doing it this time in a mirrored position. And then once the horn piece had finished cooling down, this is what it looked like. Pretty nice, right? And as you can see, what started out as a straight line is now a nice curved piece. Now, for the actual mask in-game, you can see it has this large glowing eye thing in the middle, and to make that, I opted to use a plastic Christmas ornament. I first used my box cutter knife and a pair of scissors to carefully cut the bauble in half. Once I had done that, this is what I ended up with, though of course I also had to later trim off those edges along the top. Since this eyeball thing glows in the game, I wanted it to glow in real life, and so to do that I used this little purple LED keychain thing. I thought about using some actual LED circuitry with a battery and a switch and all of that, but I didn't have any purple LEDs and I already had this full completed circuit with a switch, battery, and LED, so I decided to just use this little ring light. The first thing that I did, as you can see, was take off the actual keychain part. Then I took a tape measure and measured along the outside edge of what I would be using for the eyeball, tracing that onto black Worbla and then cutting it out. That then created a nice rim that I could wrap around the outside of the bauble. Since Worbla gets pretty sticky and sticks to itself and other things pretty well when you heat it up, all I had to do was thoroughly heat it up on both sides and then wrap it around the outside of what would become the eyeball, sticking it carefully to itself and also to the bauble. For something to attach the LED light to, I attached another thin strip of Worbla along the bottom edge of the bauble and then used some hot glue to further attach the light to that. I then heated up the Worbla again and took this piece that I used a little bit of thicker EVA foam for and then carefully connected them together, completing the actual base part for the eyeball. A quick thing to note, these plastic baubles will melt if you accidentally get a heat gun on them. So don't make the same mistake I did and accidentally melt your bauble. Please be careful with that. Anyway, once I had finished completing the base piece for the eyeball, it was time to paint it. These are the different paint colors that I used. I first started out by taking some white and dabbing it along the inside of the bauble, carefully smoothing and creating a nice gradient that went outwards to blue and then purple. I did it on the inside so that the outside of the bauble would still remain smooth and shiny, and I didn't do a super thick layer since I still needed the light to shine through. But since I still did want to diffuse the light just a little bit, I took some purple tissue paper and hot glued that to the inside of the bauble, adding just a little bit more of diffusion. I then trimmed off the excess tissue paper, and then for the eyeball we were good to go. All I had to do was reconnect it to the Worbla pieces. Speaking of the actual Worbla pieces, let's get back to the main base build of the mask. For the actual mask, it needed to be a little bit more curved like it was in the game, so I first thoroughly heated up both sides of the base mask piece, then taking my box cutter knife and making a nice straight cut down the middle of the back. Once I did that, I was able to carefully curve the base piece, holding it in that curved shape until it cooled down and then it just remained in that shape. I then did that same thing to the pieces that would lay on top of the middle of the mask, heating them up and then cutting them down the middle so I could curve them to better fit the base of the mask. After that, I thoroughly heated up the base piece of the mask as well as the pieces I would be attaching onto the mask and then carefully pressed them together. Since Worbla sticks to itself when you heat it up, you really don't need any type of glue or anything. All you have to do is heat them up and stick them together. Once that was done, this is what the first pieces connected together looked like. Then I connected all of the other pieces of the mask together, carefully heating them all up, heating up the base piece, and then carefully layering them all together. This took some time, but I'm really happy with the result. For the LED keychain inside the eyeball, there was a small switch on the back which I needed to be able to turn on and off. To be able to access that switch, I heated up the base piece of Worbla and foam and then carefully stabbed it with scissors until I had a hole through it that I could use to turn the switch on and off. I then took the eyeball piece, added some hot glue around the rim, and then carefully pressed it onto the base build of the mask. I had to heat up the Worbla just a little bit more to get everything to lay nice and smooth, but in the end, this is what the completed base build for the mask looked like. I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. And as you can see on the back, there is a small hole where I can reach through with my finger and turn the LED switch on and off. But now that the base build for the mask was completed, it is time to prime and paint it. First off, I didn't want any primer or paint getting onto the plastic Christmas ornament eyeball thing, so I took some painter's tape and carefully laid that along the edges of the eyeball, making sure that nothing would get onto it. Then finally I could move on to priming the mask. For this I used some Elmer's wood glue and a simple paintbrush. Taking that paintbrush, I painted a layer of wood glue primer over the entire surface of the mask, making sure to get all of the edges and little details. Once the layer of wood glue had completely dried, it was time to sand it. For this, I used a somewhat fine grit of sandpaper and then used that to sand the entire surface of the mask, doing my best to get rid of any layers and texture. Once that was done, I did a second layer of wood glue over the entire surface of the mask, let that dry, and sanded it once again. Next, it was time to move on to painting. I like to do a layer of black base coat over the entire surface of my build, so I first started out with that. Next, I mixed together these 4 different paints from plaid, mainly the 2 in the middle, until I had a nice deep shade of red. Once the layer of black paint had dried, I took this shade of red and painted it over the entire surface of the mask. Just one layer of red didn't quite have the coverage I wanted, so I did a second layer and then a third as well. And once all of those layers had been painted on and had dried, this is what the mask looked like. I wanted to add some shadows and dimension to it, so I took this small paintbrush with very dark red, almost black paint, and then carefully dabbed that into the corners and lowest edges of the mask, taking a paper towel afterwards and quickly dabbing most of it off again. Through the process of layering this darker paint and then wiping a lot of it off again with a damp paper towel, I eventually ended up with a nice layer of shadows, adding a lot more realism to the mask. I followed this same pattern of painting on shadows and wiping some of them off again over the entire surface of the mask. After that, I peeled the painter's tape off of the eyeball and touched up the edges of paint around that. Next, it was time to seal the entire surface of the mask, using this satin Mod Podge that I got from Plaid as a part of them accepting me into their creative community, so thank you for that, Plaid. For adding the layer of sealer, all I did was paint a thin, smooth layer over the entire surface of the mask. And then the mask was done. I am really happy with how this turns out, and I wanted to again thank Worbla for sponsoring me to create this build. If you want to see how it glows, just hang on a minute. I did think about making this wearable, maybe with some elastic, but it didn't really fit human face proportions, so I decided not to. But I did promise you could see how it glows, so on the back we will just turn on this small switch here, and then turn out the lights, and you can see that the eyeball does in fact glow. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all next time.